Uy, cuidado.
Maria. I'm Michelle Bachelet. Hello, good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Geneva Debate, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you for this very, very critical debate, which we hope will determine who is going to be the next Secretary General of the United Nations. So we're going to start recording very quickly because our satellite link has actually started. Just want to remind you, please turn your mobile phones off. We have members of the press with us, so please do feel free, members of the press, to take photographs. If you want to take photographs, take them now so we don't have any flashes while we are actually recording. And we've got lots of cameras everywhere, so just be on your best behaviour because the camera may be on you. No, blowing your nose or whatever. If you need to do that now. So... And we've got questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions from the audience. They're just ones which we've already planned. There's no time to take any more. And I will ask you, please, to stay sitting in your seats until we release you. And whenever anybody starts clapping, please do clap. If I do that, that means could you stop clapping because we've got to get on with the show, with the debate. Okay, so... I think we can... Oh, thank you. Good, yes. What I said also goes with the candidates. Yes, good. So we have a wonderful line-up here. I'll introduce them to you in a moment. We also have some films which are going to be played, so do watch those as well. So, without further ado, as they say, we are going to start recording. More than 80 years after its founding, the question... Sorry. No, I'm going to do my introduction. I'm going to start the show, yes, but not the film yet. You are going to see the film. Okay, Geraldine, I'll go in about... I'm not going mad talking to myself. I've got somebody in my ear here with timings and so on. So, Geraldine, I will start in about... Patrick, where are you? Where's Patrick? Can't see Patrick. Okay, all right, I'll start in about 5. Okay? Geraldine, Gigi? Our camera's rolling. Okay. I can't hear you. Can we start? Hello, I'm Zainab Badawi. Welcome to the Maison de la Paix in Geneva for this UN Secretary-General debate. Now, of course, Geneva is a city which is home to numerous UN bodies, so there is a lot of buzz in the city about who is going to be the next Secretary-General of the United Nations, who will succeed Antonio Guterres at the start of the year. Well, currently there are 5 candidates. 3 of them are with me here on stage. We have a video intervention from the 4th. So we're going to be testing their suitability by asking them questions from our audience here about whether they are really the right person to take on this enormous role at a critical time, not only for the UN itself, but at a time in global history. Before we hear from the candidates, we're going to set the scene with this brief film. More than 80 years after its founding, the question of who leads the United Nations is more important than ever before because in 2026, the global order is at a decisive moment. There's not only a series of protracted conflicts which scar the world, but there's also a growing distrust in global institutions and a weakening of the multilateral consensus that has held since the Second World War. Despite these pressures, the United Nations remains the only universal forum where all member states can come together, an institution that is often a lifeline for millions of people around the world. At the same time, it's being called upon to become more agile, representative and effective, capable of responding to the challenges of the 21st century.
And that is why the choice of the next Secretary-General is not merely a moment of institutional transition, it is a decision about the very future of multilateralism. The leadership required today demands more than just diplomatic experience. It calls for a figure who can uphold the UN Charter and the principles of international law, someone who can strengthen cooperation in a fragmented world, someone who can turn conflict and confrontation into dialogue and negotiation. In a nutshell, the UN Charter's founding principles uphold the human rights of all peoples and equality between men and women and nations, big or small. The UN needs leadership that can act in profoundly difficult, dangerous and complex environments, with an understanding of crises on the ground and a genuine commitment to advancing sustainable solutions on a planet increasingly affected by climate change. The legitimacy of the next Secretary-General will depend not only on the support of member states, but also on the trust of societies, communities affected by conflict, and younger generations who may question the credibility of the current international system. Today, the candidates come together in a shared public debate space, a place to contrast visions, priorities and leadership approaches in a response to current global challenges. This debate is not only a presentation of candidacies, it is a global conversation at a pivotal time in history about the kind of leadership the international community needs for the years and decades ahead.
So, a brief outline there of the kind of challenges that lie ahead for the next Secretary-General of the United Nations. Now, this is a post which one former Secretary-General of the UN described as the most impossible job on this earth. So, why on earth do these candidates want to assume the position? Let me tell you who they are and we'll find out why. Rebeca Grynspan was a vice president in her native Costa Rica, and she's currently head of UNCTAD, which is the UN's body on trade and development. But Rebeca, I know you've stepped down temporarily while you're doing all your candidacy stuff. So thank you. Very nice to see you, Rebeca. And also we have María Espinosa from Ecuador, where she served as foreign and defense minister. And Maria, you've also been president of the UN General Assembly, so welcome to you. And Michelle Bachelet was president of Chile until 2018, but she's an old UN hand. She's also been head of UN Women and the UN Human Rights Council. So that is our panel here with us. Welcome to you all. Give them a round of applause. Thank you. And as I said at the outset, there are 5 candidates. We also have President Macky Sall, former president of Senegal, who has sent us a video intervention. We'll be hearing from him a little bit later. And also Rafael Grossi from Argentina, who is the current head of the IAEA. That's the UN's body, International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, he's not available to be with us, and he also chose not to send us a video. So now, let's start with our questions from our audience here in the Maison de la Paix. And the first question is from Eugenia Rogers, who's a Geneva Graduate Institute student. Eugenia, your question, please.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. My question for you is that many young people around the world feel that multilateral institutions are struggling to deliver on the challenges that matter most to our futures. So what would you do as Secretary General to rebuild trust in the United Nations among younger generations and demonstrate that multilateralism can still be a force for change? Thank you.
So let's take that second bit of the question there, because we're going to talk about the role of the SG presently. So how can you revive trust in multilateralism? Rebeca.
Well, I think that first we need to listen to you, not only invite you. I think that it's true that the young people feel very worried about their future. And I think that there is a lot of skepticism, as you said, with respect to the UN and the multilateral system. I will nonetheless call on you not to allow skepticism to go to fatalism. Skepticism is a question, but fatalism is a surrender. So I call on you not to allow anybody to tell you or to tell us that we have no choices and that we cannot do better. My second point is that you will rebuild trust when you will deliver, as you said, in your problems, when we will address conflicts that are recruiting you and displacing you, when we will care about the planet that we will inherit, that we live in and you will inherit, when we will face the debt problem that doesn't allow your country to invest in their people, in education and health, when we will give you a seat in defining the technologies and what we will do for the future. So delivering on the challenges. But let me ask all of you here. We want you to trust us, but do you know what is the percentage of young people under 30?
You're supposed to be answering the questions, not asking them. But anyway.
Do you know? Do you have any idea? Do you have any idea?
Okay, let's assume
4%.
Oh, right.
4%. So an institution that wants you to trust us cannot make you invisible. If you're invisible, you will never trust us.
Okay.
And so building trust starts also but what we have to do inside the UN, not only outside the UN.
Thank you. María Espinosa, your answer to that question. So global challenges require a multilateral response, essentially, is what Rebecca's been saying.
Well, I can relate very well to her. I understand exactly why one would feel disappointed, because trust is not something you declare, it's something you earn. And the way to earn the trust and the credibility is through delivery. And I think the UN does not suffer from a crisis of purpose or principles enshrined in the Charter. It suffers from a crisis of delivery, of impact, of accountability, and of inclusion. And of course, when we see a young person asking that question, we have come up with the Declaration on Future Generations, a new office for young people, but it is not only about listening to young people. It's about having them being the architects of their own future, not the victims, but the agents of transformation. In the multilateral space, what that means is decisions that are taken in the multilateral space have to listen to the younger generations, have them bring their ideas and innovation, and transform the system. As Secretary General, this is the transformation I want to lead, an intergenerational transformation to regain the trust, the credibility, and the purpose of the UN through delivery. It is about impact. It is about touching and transforming people's lives. That's exactly what the UN was called to do. The first phrase of the Charter, which is my favorite one, is "we the peoples." And of course, we the peoples is the 1.5 billion young people around there. In my own team now, as a candidate, most of my team are under 30. And it's not to check the box. It is about having them giving the intelligence, the advice, and being part of the proposals that I am bringing to the UN, a UN that has to be credible and trusted, has to be earned.
Thank you. Michelle Bachelet.
Well, I agree what both have said already, of course. But I think, and I remember once working at UNAIDS and UN Women, and a girl says to me, it's not enough that I'll be sitting in the table. I want to discuss the shape of the table. So young people have ideas. In many of the areas that we see as huge challenges and need a multilateral answer, like climate change and others, and AI, etc., young people can play a direct role because they have they're creative, they have innovative perspective, etc. So I do believe that what the Secretary General has to do, a future Secretary General, is to ensure that the UN not only communicates better, but really is results-oriented. Because, as you said, María Fernanda, and I agree on that, it's delivery what people will realize. Is this institution doing what they have to do? Is it having the answer that we need? And is it not only listening to us, but because you can listen and not do anything about it afterwards, is they're taking into consideration our demands, our needs? But I have to say also that multilateralism has a lot of problems. But if we didn't have a multilateral system, children in the refugee camps wouldn't have vaccines. People on displacement wouldn't have support. So there's a lot of things that multilateralism has done, and we need to improve everything that needs to be done better.
But multilateralism and the UN are not the same thing. I mean, there are lots of regional bodies, the African Union, the European Union, ASEAN, and so on. And a lot of people are saying, actually, this is a more pragmatic approach to multilateralism, bite-sized chunk. We're asking too much of the UN, 193 countries, to try and get consensus. It becomes, you just get institutional inertia. So perhaps all of you would just address this issue of regional bodies very quickly. Do you think that perhaps they are less unwieldy than the UN as a multilateral tool? Michelle Bachelet.
Well, yes, and I think this is clear, for example, when you have to deal with issues of peace and security, or when we are talking about financing for development. I mean, all these regional groups, you mentioned many of them, but also the development banks in different regions can play an important role as well.
Regional bodies, shout out for them.
Well, what I would say that the world has changed in these 8 years. The role of regions, the role of banks, the role of the private sector, it's extremely important. The UN is not the only game in town anymore. Mm-hmm. But the UN is irreplaceable because it's the only universal platform that brings all countries together to face and respond to the challenges of the world of today. We are living an era of radical interdependence. The big question is how we govern interdependence. The UN, I think, is absolutely the only universal body that brings everybody together.
That's both its strength and weakness. You can't get
the phrase I have been using is, the UN is unique, but it's not alone. There are much more capacities today outside the UN, not like in 1945. But the UN has a culture problem because we want everything to come on the UN. We don't know how to deeply partner, real partnership. Take into account, for example, the African Union. We have resolutions trying to make them much a stronger actor in peace and security. We still haven't made that happen. So implementation of real partnership is really lagging behind because of the culture of the UN. So we need to refocus. We are unique. We have to do the things in which we are unique, but we have to learn how to partner.
I don't pose it as a question, but we know that 42% of the UN's funding comes from the United States and China. US currently $4 billion in arrears, and China owes about $500 million currently. So, there is a question of, can you do anything if you don't have the money? And Antonio Guterres, we know, has been saying, I don't have the money, I'm going to run out very soon. But anyway, that's a question for another day. You mentioned the African Union, and indeed...
For our nightmares, you mean?
That's going to be something for you to grapple with, getting the money if any one of you assumes the role. Well, somebody else who wants to assume the position of Secretary General of the UN is one of our candidates, Macky Sall, former president of Senegal. He couldn't be with us, but he has sent us this video message setting out his perspective on multilateralism.
I believe that the international system is fragmented because trust has been weakened. And without trust, multilateralism cannot deliver. If selected Secretary General, I would champion 3 concrete changes. First, I would work to bring the United Nations back to its member states. Reform must be owned by countries. large and small, north and south. The UN must listen more and act with more inclusiveness. As Secretary General, I will be a bridge builder, someone able to speak to everyone, listen to everyone, bring positions closer, and maintain dialogue even in times of high tension. Second, I would make the UN more effective on the ground. Mandate must be rationalized and clear, resources better used, and results better measured. Third, while taking care of human rights, I would also make development a central pillar of peace. We cannot fight terrorism, instability, or migration only with security responses. We must win the battle of development by promoting jobs for youth, women, investment, infrastructure, climate justice, and fair access to finance. The Secretary General has no army and no police. His true strength is credibility, impartiality, and moral authority. I'm not running for a career. I'm running for impact, to rebuild trust, restore dialogue, and help make the United Nations a stronger tool of collective action.
Macky Sall, the former president of Senegal, making his pitch on how he would restore trust in the UN and deliver on multilateralism. So now we can go to a second question from our audience. And former executive director of the Kofi Annan Foundation, Kofi Annan, of course, the late Kofi Annan, a former Secretary General of the UN himself. And we have a question from Corinne Momal-Vanion on leadership. Thank you.
Good afternoon. And the question I'd like to ask the candidates is, what is their vision of the role of the Secretary General in peace and security? Is it that of a Secretary General who is a political actor in her own right, and who can take initiatives and shape global diplomacy along the lines of articulated by Boutros Ghali 30 years ago in his Agenda for Peace? Or is it more of a Secretary General focused primarily on facilitating cooperation among member states, as put forward by Antonio Guterres in his new Agenda for Peace 3 years ago? Thank you very much.
Okay, I should just add that there is something in the Charter, isn't there, the UN Charter, Article 99, which allows the Secretary General to invoke, to take it to the Security Council if she feels that there's a real threat to international peace and security. And Antonio Guterres, I believe, has only actually ever done this once in 2023. Yeah. During the Israel-Gaza conflict and so on. So just to bear that in mind as well, whether you would trigger the use of Article 99. Maria.
Well, I didn't say that, but bonjour. Bonjour, Excellence, cher ami. Je suis vraiment ravie d'être ici à Genève. Yeah. Cette Genève internationale.
English, if you don't.
Yeah, in English, but I think multilingualism is extremely important. I think the French language is also very important. In the hub of the UN here in Geneva, it's a francophone, and I understand that there is no translation, but I wanted to say hello.
You all speak French, don't you?
And bonjour, and bonjour. Yeah. My question is not an either-or response. I think a Secretary General should use every tool provided in the Charter to be, first of all, work very strongly on prevention. That's why I'm proposing a prevention and early action hub. Has to work as a peacemaker, has to work also to support others when they take the lead on peacemaking, and has to be an honest broker and impartial agent. But impartiality doesn't mean a silence or paralysis. It really means to be able to bring all the parties together. I did that when I was president of the UN General Assembly. I brought 193 countries together to discuss very complex and contentious issues. Is the ability to convene, the ability to really serve as a true bridge builder, but it is also to be active, to be present, to be seen when a conflict is about to erupt or when a conflict has already happened. Early warning, early action are of utmost importance. As we said, the UN is not the only game in town, but the Secretary General should be foot on the ground, active, present, engaged, and be trusted by all member states.
So a UN Secretary General out in the field as much as possible. Okay, Michelle Bachelet.
Well, I agree also that you have to be both. And of course, it will depend on the moment and which is the role that you have to play. On one hand, if you have a person who wants to a facilitator, but that has no independent judgment, that's not going to be a facilitator, that's going to be a moderator, and the UN doesn't need a moderator as a Secretary General. If you have, on the other hand, somebody who is independent but has no capability to build trust across the different sides of the problem, you will not be a peacemaker, you will be a commentator of news. So what we need is somebody who understands the moment, and we have the tools. It's not true that we don't have the tools. The Charter mentions many of them. Of course, the good offices. Of course, early warning. You need to have early warning signs. You need to mediate. You need to identify who can be your allies in terms of making good results. There's a lot of things that many of us in our former capacity have done many times. The thing, I think, is not the lack of tools. The problem we have is there no capacity in the system to read the early warning signs. And I've seen it many times, and I discussed that being Executive Director of UN Women and as High Commissioner. I always said, but I don't have the time now, that I went to a country, I knew there was going to come a coup d'etat. I mentioned to everybody said I was crazy, and the coup d'etat came 2 weeks later. Because you have to read what's happening in the country. The last thing I have to say is that by many times what the Secretary needs to do is to facilitate the relation between countries. For example, to find a room or space where people can come together and dialogue. But on the other hand, or to open channels when people are refusing to speak to each other. Sometimes silence cannot happen. You cannot be a complex of silence. If civilians are being killed, the Secretary General has to speak. But also has to work and dialogue with all member states. That doesn't mean dialogue, doesn't mean endorsement. I mean, you can dialogue and work with countries that you have, or governments that you have criticized. I have worked with governments I have publicly criticized. But that doesn't mean endorsement. It means that you have to engage to try to produce the results needed. So I think the Secretary has to be both. And the thing is to identify what can work. Because sometimes preventive diplomacy is very important. Sometimes you have to be actively on the field, mediating, but anticipating. I think the US has difficulties to anticipate and to prevent crisis from happening.
Rebecca.
Yeah, well, you know, hearing the question, the first thing that comes to mind is Kofi Annan. Yes, Kofi Annan was an independent leader and a very effective leader at the same time. So his example is a good one to follow, yes? I really, you know, I think that my criteria of success as SG is not that nobody will ask me again, where is the UN? If that question continues, we will be irrelevant. So the important thing is to be there. We have become too risk-averse. We cannot do that. Our only risk and our only failure is not to try. And in many cases, I have to say, we have stopped trying. And we have to try and try again because we are the ones, and the Secretary General is the person that can assume the cost of failure, the cost of rejection. And we have to do that. We have to be courageous to be able to do that. Try again and try again. We have to navigate many no's until we get a yes. That's what happened when I intervened in the Black Sea Initiative, yes? Nobody believed that we could do that. We did that within the framework of a war, but we understood that we can agree on something that can be important for millions of people in the world, even if we don't agree on everything. And the other thing is to engage. We have said that. I believe in early warning, but to tell you the truth, early warning is not an information system. We many times think about early warning as a lot of information that we see indicators. No, early warning is to listen to the ground, is to listen to the people that is in all the countries of the world. And sometimes the headquarters is a wall between the ground and what the decisions that have to be taken. And just the last point, for that to be effective, you have to have the best team. We have to change the office of the Secretary General and have the best team with the Secretary General to be effective.
You mentioned the Black Sea thing. That's the UN-Turkey agreement that was struck to allow Ukraine to export its grain throughout this the conflict, because obviously lots of countries were not getting their grain from Ukraine, which was seen as a great success, I think, 2022, 23. But, you know, a lot of people would say, gone are the days when we saw a UN Secretary General shuffling between Washington and Moscow, trying to sort out the Cuban Missile Crisis, Javier Pérez de Cuellar in 1988, mediating between Iraq and Iran, Dag Hammarskjöld famously trying to bring peace to the Congo and so on. As the world's top diplomat, a lot of people are now saying, you're absent, you're irrelevant. Antonio Guterres says the US-Israeli war on Iran is illegal, but nobody really pays any attention. So all of you are obviously women. We've not to date had a Secretary General who is female. You go to the UN headquarters and all the pictures, of course, are men. This is the 10th one. I just wonder if all of you could just answer this point. Do you feel that, particularly in terms of your diplomatic skills, that your gender brings something different to the table? Michelle?
Well, I think that gender, yes, but not any women, if I have to say. One of the reasons that I've been in many different posts is because I'm not trying to maintain myself at that post. I try to do what is needed to be done. So I'm not afraid of risking that when I try doesn't work. I'm not afraid of speaking up when it's needed. I'm not afraid to take a plane and get into the place where I need to be, where I have to talk to and produce a dialogue. So I think women that are there to do these kind of things, we're not too many candidates, not many there, it's because we really believe that we want to put all our energy and to produce the results needed for the world.
María Espinosa.
Well, I think, of course, a woman, it's about time, isn't it? After 80 years, of course. But what I say is we need a 360 leader with a lot of energy. What does it mean? Is that you master the 3 pillars of the UN. That you've been Minister of Defense, and it's not I want to speak about my own bio, but you really need to master. No, you need to master the 3 pillars, understand how they come together, and have the energy to act and transform. And I differ about the issue of prevention. Prevention and early warning have to be more than a slogan. It has to be an operating principle. It has to be the tool that the Secretary General has to inform and to advise member states so they can act. Right. To inform yourself so you can act. So basically a 360 Secretary General and, of course, a woman, the best woman, not any woman.
Okay. Rebecca, on this issue of gender?
I'm running to be Secretary General because I think I am the best person for the job.
Okay. Short and sweet, thank you. And there is, it's a sort of unwritten thought. I mean, it's not actually stated explicitly that it is the turn of Latin America and the Caribbean. And, of course, we also, I mean, that's just a sort of convention. That I think the last person was Javier Pérez de Cuellar from Peru, wasn't it?
Yes.
So, and that was in the 80s. So now let's go to another question from our audience, a graduate of NYU in New York. And Tamau Chika, you want to ask a question on the burning topic of climate. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. As a young person, I will live with the consequence of climate change, climate decisions made today. Yet many countries most affected by climate change often have the least influence over global climate decisions and face debt burdens. And climate change is an intersectional issue in which forced migration disproportionately affects women and marginalized communities. So as Secretary General, how would you ensure that climate governance becomes more equitable and responsive to those on the front lines of the crisis? Thank you.
Michelle Bachelet, there's so many facets to climate, of course, but that one seems essentially about climate justice.
Yeah. It's really important what she was mentioning, because the places who are being more affected, we're talking about small islands, for example, or low coastal communities, or communities who live in places where they are already having the impact of high sea levels and of course of the extreme weather. They're usually, as you mentioned correctly, they're not sitting at the table where they make decisions. And I think the Secretary General, one of the things that needs to be doing, on one hand, is to ensure in the Secretariat and the whole system more representative. Countries who usually don't have those places, they have to be there so they can bring their issues, not only in the General Assembly, but also inside the office of the Secretary General. I think also that we need to ensure that what we sign, I'd signed as President of the Republic the Agreement of Paris, and we know what needs to be done. We all know what works. And what is lacking is, on one hand, enough finance, because the Loss and Damage Fund was a great idea, but it's undercapitalized, so it's not working. But we also need to implement the Paris Agreement. And in that sense, what I would do is I will bring together all the communities that are affected, sit with them, with the member states, and create sort of a big, I would say, sense of urgency that we need to deal with this, because it's not a matter of future, it's a matter of life taken today, and of course in the future generations. But I also believe that that we need to ensure that all what the finance given to those member states that are fighting with a terrible debt, it's not possible that it has to be given by loans. They have to receive money with grants, because they cannot. They're drowning, and we're asking them to ask for loans with a debt service that's so big, it's higher than they can use in health, in education, but also in climate mitigation and adaptation. So we need to change many things to continue pushing for the urgency that is for humanity, climate change, but not only climate change, pollution, and of course loss of biodiversity, the triple issue, but also to ensure that the countries have the way to respond to that.
Rebeca, Grynspan.
Yes. Well, I worked extensively on the intersection of climate and development. When I was vice president of my country and the Minister of Finance before that, Costa Rica reverted with the right policies deforestation. We have today a greener country than we did 40 years ago. And we started with these services for environmental services. And we really strengthened the voice of Costa Rica in the international community, because we were credible, we walked the talk. So I think that is very important in terms of helping and supporting countries with the right policies inside the countries. But second, what the UN can do. First, I think that we need to bring adaptation to also the discussion, not only mitigation. Countries, and you mentioned, Michelle, the seeds or the LDCs are already suffering the consequence of climate change. So financing adaptation and the adaptation agenda is central to what we are discussing. Second, we have to scale up finance. But we have also to simplify finance. You know, countries spend years sometimes to be able to get a loan from the funds that we have, from the climate funds and the environmental funds that we already have. They don't have the capacities many times. It's cumbersome and it's bureaucratic. We have to change also the system. And third, we have to bring the multilateral development banks and the private sector to the financial flows to go to the countries that are not receiving them. Only 2% of the foreign direct investment in renewable energy goes to Africa, 2% of the total of the world. If we don't partner with the multilateral system, with the multilateral development banks, and crowd in private investment, it won't happen in these countries. And lastly, you know, the clauses for debt. I think that Michelle, you mentioned that. I think that that's very important. Debt and climate have to be part of the same conversation because today the countries don't have the fiscal space to invest in their people and to invest in the transition for a sustainable development.
María Espinosa.
Well, I love that question because I share the same frustration. I have been a climate negotiator for decades, and believe me, I don't know what was more difficult, climate negotiations or when I led the peace talks between the ELN and the government of Colombia. Frankly, why is that we have had 30 COPs, very soon 31 COPs, 31 times we have met to discuss and agree and decide, and emissions continue to grow, and climate shocks continue to destroy lives, livelihoods, your future, and the future of younger generations. So there is a frustration there. But why is it so difficult? It is difficult because climate is not an environmental issue only. It is a development issue. It is a macroeconomic issue. It's a security issue. It's an industrialization and competitiveness issue. So that is why it's so difficult. Saying it is difficult, I'm not saying it is impossible. I truly believe that climate change is human-made. It was created by us. And the solutions are there because we have the technologies, we have the knowledge. We need to scale up finance, but there is plenty of money out there. What we need is the vision, the political will, the voices and the agency of young people. We need indigenous peoples at the table. We need the private sector. And we need to bring, as my colleagues have said so clearly, we need to bring the discussion on debt, on fiscal space, on foreign investment, on supply chains to the climate discussion. Is it easy? It is not easy, but it can be done, especially if the younger generations are part of the solutions and are agents of transformation.
You all say it can be done. You've all provided excellent analysis about why we should do it and so on, but it comes against a very difficult global landscape. You know, you mentioned the Paris Treaty. The US, of course, withdrew, completing that in 2020. The problems with the Strait of Hormuz conflict has rekindled everybody's interests in the use of fossil fuels and so on. Not necessarily new exploration, but certainly a retreat back into gas. And you mentioned, you know, the money and how little has gone in. And we know that 2009, the Copenhagen Climate Summit said, you know, $100 billion a year should be paid into adaptation and mitigation. But so far, only fractions of money have come in. So all I can say is good luck to the next Secretary General on, you know, trying to bring about change on this very, very difficult agenda because, you know, the money and the atmosphere has really, really changed. All right, well, you said that climate is related to development. And in fact, we do have a question about development from Martin Chung Gong, who's the outgoing Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union till the end of this month. Martin's in position. Martin, your question.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Congratulations to the candidates here. The next Secretary General of the UN will assume office in early 2027, less than 3 years to the expiry of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are generally agreed that these goals, when it comes to progress, has been uneven and, in some cases, insufficient, largely off track. So, as the next Secretary General of the UN, how do you propose to work to bring these SDGs back on track? And subsidiary question, do you consider it important to engage national parliaments in this conversation? Thank you.
So, quite right. They were pledges that people pledged, governments pledged, but there was no real, legal undertaking. So you say slightly off track. I'll just give you an idea. As you all know, 17 Sustainable Development Goals with about 169 targets. Only 18% of those 169 targets have actually been met. And there's a deficit of about $4 trillion a year globally to try to meet these SDGs. So you can see 2030, a mere 4 years away, and we are way off track. Rebecca, your answer, please.
Thank you. Very easy one.
Okay.
Let me first say that I am really worried about some of the indicators going backward, not even forward. We have 96 million people today in hunger, more than in 2015. So we are talking here about really serious backlash that started also with COVID. We forgot COVID already, but many of the countries will never recover. And also hunger that has come with conflict has gone up. And so I think that it's very important that looking at the future, we remember that most of the indicators of the SDGs are national indicators, are at the national level. So is national governments the ones that have to drive this agenda? And there, Marty, your question, because to drive this agenda at the national level, we need parliaments. We need those that have the voice, have the laws in their hands to be able to partner with the government for this to happen. And the UN has to be there. You know, I've been in the UN long enough to know that we have to defend it because I believe in the UN, but also the things that have to change. We are still very supply-driven with the countries. We need to be much more demand-driven to be able to help the countries in achieving the SDGs. It won't only happen because we take an account of who has, gotten, who is on the way to the SDGs and who is not. We need to put back our effort at the country level so we can really make the SDGs go farther towards 2030.
All right. María Espinosa, SG's got to be an advocate for the SDGs.
Well, I think the SDGs are the right ambition, the right roadmap, the right shared narrative. They have been extremely important in pushing the development agenda. But the problem is that ambition is not action. Ambition does not transform people's lives on the ground. I'm also worried not only of the lack of development of the 18% targets met on track, I'm also very worried about regression and stagnation. And what to do about that? First of all, I strongly believe that development cannot be delivered from New York. That's absolutely something that we need to learn. Number two, I agree with Rebecca. Development needs to be nationally owned, funded, supported, and the role of the UN here, and particularly of the Secretary General, is to help countries to deliver their development pathways. But of course, there are direct actions, but there are also what we call the structural hurdles of development. The UN can help there. For example, to ensure that there is a profound reform of the international financial architecture. The UN is not a bank, but it's a convener. It has the data, it has the information, it can provide the advice, the space for multilateral banks to come together. and to have that conversation. We saw it with a very strong outcome of the Sevilla commitment. And I think we cannot wait until 2030, the last day, to start thinking about the future. As Secretary General, I will work hand by hand with member states to imagine a development era that is nationally owned with the three things that developing countries need.
All right.
Money and resources, technology and institutional capacity.
Thank you. Michelle Bachelet.
Well, yes, I think sometimes we think on development that we have a problem with money, with resources, and it's true, but it's not that there's not enough global wealth. I mean, there's 430 trillion a year as a wealth. And the gap on financing for development is 4.3 trillion every year. So there are resources, and those resources can come with all the different areas that we have already spoke now and in before. I mean, of course, the international financial institution, and I agree, they need to be reformed because they were created in a different area with different challenges. And now we need those institutions, and not only the World Bank and the IMF, the whole group of the IDB, the Asian Development, the African Development Bank, all to work together with the private sector as well, because many of these things are really important. If we don't have development, if we fail with developing countries, we're failing to the people. And we are failing to our aspiration of peace and security. We're failing to our aspiration also of ensuring people their human rights. So development needs to be owned, nationally owned, and in that sense, but not only by state members, because having been a president, what I saw, that when you have a policies that last and not become completely evaporated when the next election comes, is when legislature owns it as well. So Parliament, Martin, are really essential, because we need parliamentarians to own development and own those goals, and to be part of that, and to ensure that the laws can, I would say, reflect what is needed to ensure all these possibilities. Today there's a discussion what will come in the future. Some people say that next year the UN will be discussing the next step. And I think the next step probably will have to think about it very seriously. Fewer promises, but promises that you can ensure that will be solved, that will be funded, and that you will defend it. Because I think what people want is that their lives improve. And that's it, not to have hundreds and hundreds of goals, but goals who really can improve people's lives. Goals that really can ensure that children can go to school, that go to the clinic, that pregnant women can have children in a clinic. That's are the things that people want in the daily life. And that's what I think that one of the things that women can bring to this role as well is more humanism. Because I believe we need more humanism. And people need hope.
It's interesting, and you mentioned peace and security, as several of you have, and I think on this question of, but all of you said there is the money. I'm always struck by that one figure that obviously conflict is a big driver of a lack of development, and the UN's global peacekeeping budget is $5.38 billion, which is equivalent to 16 hours of global military expenditure. Yeah. So when you say it's a question of priorities and where you put your money, it's very interesting. We didn't talk about peacekeeping, but of course that's a very important role that the UN does. So we've now got a compound question about two sort of related topics on science, technology and AI. First of all, from Robert Digraph, who is President-elect of the International Science Council. Your question, please.
Well, thank you so much for creating a place for science and technology in this very interesting debate. It's clear in the future, science will be more important to address global challenges, and it can be a source of optimism. So what are your ideas to make the role of science in the UN more stronger, more structural, and particularly more equitable, in the sense of engaging all member states in terms of gender equality, but also in terms of listening to the voice of the next generation like my colleague here.
Yeah, thank you. If you could hand the microphone, in fact, to Tatuli Khidesheli, who is an IE university student who wants to explore the topic of AI. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here. Thank you for sharing your insights. Emerging technologies and artificial intelligence are transforming societies globally. Yet, many of the most important decisions about these technologies are made by a small number of states and private companies. What role should the United Nations play in ensuring that all countries have a meaningful voice in shaping the rules that govern emerging technologies? Thank you.
Okay, so you've got 2 minutes, candidates, to answer both those questions. Maria, you kick off. Thank you.
Why me? Why me?
Yeah,
So
well.
Well, first of all, the role of science, absolutely vital. But I think the UN has the science capacity scattered in many places, and I think that we really need to make sure that there is a space and place for coherent use and organized use of science into decision making. How is that you build in science into daily decision making within the UN system? Second, on AI, I think artificial intelligence is not a tech issue alone. It is a jobs issue. It is an economic issue. It's a security issue. It's an ethics issue. And the UN is perhaps the best place to deal with the complexity of AI, which is really having an impact in our lives today, but in our lives in the future. We have come with the Global Digital Compact that was agreed by all member states. We are now about to have in July here in Geneva the first global dialogue on artificial intelligence governance. And I think that there is a very important role for the UN to bring all the parties to the conversation. An inclusive dialogue, perhaps not to prescribe, but to ensure that the use of artificial intelligence is human-centered, is ethical, and for the common good. Okay. Actually, I think the dialogue taking place here in July is called Artificial Intelligence for Good. I think that is the collective responsibility that we all have. So, of course, the private sector, the UN should not stop innovation, of course, but the UN should bring and use its convening power to have everybody at the table, especially the younger generation.
All right. Michelle Bachelet?
Well, I'm a physician. So for me, I always used science-based evidence to try to understand better. And I also try to think, and that's why also looking after the root causes of what we're looking at, to try to find the best solutions. So I believe science plays a substantial role. I mean, we have seen it, for example, in the response to COVID, of course. That was really important. And the good thing is that the scientific sector probably was the only sector from the beginning that was work with solidarity, that they exchanged the information, the DNAs that could be brought up to the vaccine. So I really believe that science has to play a role. On climate change, science also has so much to say how things are going if we have to change. On the issue of AI, as High Commissioner of Human Rights, we work a lot with Silicon Valley and with all the companies, trying to understanding that AI is essential, is a part of our lives in the future. It has so many beneficial issues, but at the same time, a lot of challenges. In human rights in particular, we had a lot of challenges in the use of artificial intelligence and others to, I would say, go after some human rights defenders, etc. So we work with the companies. I think the work with the companies to ensure that the human rights perspective is included from the beginning, not after they have created a product and then realize that it's bad for the human being. And lastly, I also think that we need to ensure that AI, and that's what the UN has to do, is a convening power to sit together. I mean, it's the only place, something that companies don't have, is a table of 193 member states. So we can sit together, all the stakeholders, with the 193 member states to ensure that if AI continues, and is important, and it will, that doesn't mean that the same group of countries will be left behind.
Rebeca Grynspan.
Yes, I think that we have to learn a lot from climate change. It was when we brought the science and the scientific community into the collective discussion that we could advance climate change. And I think that is very important, the AI Advisory Committee and the Scientific Committee that has been established by the Secretary General and the Digital Compact. And I think that that mirrors how important this could be, because we cannot think or discuss something we don't understand. And to understand, we need to bring the scientific community into the discussion with all the other stakeholders. So very important, the advisory committee and the scientific committee on this area. With respect to AI, I would say three very quick points.
Yes, please.
First, the principles for ethical behavior. And the UN has worked on this, UNESCO has worked on this. And they are principles and soft laws that are there that we have to implement. And I think that Michelle is right, that it has to be considered from the beginning. I remember one of the fathers of AI saying that if you don't consider the ethics from the beginning of the algorithm, then you won't be able to regulate it. So, principles. Second, development. We have to close the digital divide. And so development is very important here to be able to go further. And I have my last point. My last point is the cooperation in the UN for the future. There are three very difficult areas that we will have to discuss. Yeah. Disinformation, cybersecurity, and the autonomous lethal weapons. Those are difficult areas, and we have to see how we bring all the actors to be able to start a constructive conversation.
I'd like to leave enough time for your closing statements, which at this stage are only going to be about 90 seconds. Our final question from the audience, please. Marie-Laure Sall, Director of the Geneva Graduate Institute. You've got a question on human rights.
Congratulations first to the three of you for stepping up to the challenge. In 1957, UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld emphasized that, and I quote, "Without recognition of human rights, we shall never have peace." As Secretary General, what will be your approach to the issue of human rights? Will you be a champion for the principles that are enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights?
Michelle Bachelet, as a former UN Human Rights Commissioner.
It was funny because we decided who will start, and I received this fantastic
very
award.
Appropriate.
Well, I do believe, really, I do believe, and I'm concerned listening to some countries that if we don't respect human rights, and we don't have development, and we will never have peace and security, never. They're so interconnected and so intertwined. So if I'm Secretary General, what I would try to do is to include human rights perspective in all the areas that we need to work as UN, because that's the only way that you can build on that. But you also have to think on the whole machinery, not only the UN machinery, because what you need also is National Commission of Human Rights that do their job, judiciary that not threaten, because they are intimidated, civil society that can speak out because they don't feel fear, and also, and finally, journalists that can really speak out when things are happening. Because when you have all those institutions functioning, we need the UN, the Office of the High Commissioner, to work and have funded. It's only 4% of all the funds that it receives, so it's not much, and it needs to be supported. But we need also the whole structure to function, because we need it, when institutions work, people consider it. People can prevent violations from happening. So I think it's a lot of things need to be done, but I'm sure they have to be all over the place, if I say. Human rights has to be at the center of how we look at peace and security, development as well.
I'm going to ask you all the same thing, just as an adjunct, because we've seen a real retreat on sexual and reproductive health rights, which particularly affects women, and issues of gender, sexual identity have become quite politicized. So how would you all tackle that? If I could add that question as well, but very quickly, if you could answer that particular point, Michelle Bachelet.
Not giving up. Not giving up. Insistent and putting the women's agenda at the more important place. That's it. There's a lot of strategies, but the first thing is that we won't give up. We won't accept that backlash.
Okay. Rebecca Grynspan.
Let me add, human rights is not a menu. It's a package. We have to comply with all of them. And the countries have a responsibility to comply with human rights, with international law, and with humanitarian law. I think that we need to push back again on the politicization of human rights and humanitarian law. We fought so hard for these areas to be out of politics and to be only centered on the human needs of people. Precisely that's what humanitarian law is, what human rights is. It's not to discriminate between anybody. I think that we need the voice of everybody to push back again on the politicization of international law, of humanitarian law, and of the principles of human rights. Second, in the UN 80 process, a group for human rights was formed in the UN precisely for systematize and have a dialogue between all the system on human rights. I think that is a good idea. So, as Secretary General, I will try to resource that group properly, because many times human rights is not properly resourced. I will try for this to be effective in the objectives and not fall into it being another bureaucratic layer of, process. So let's try to make this work. I think that there are good ideas out there, and that as Secretary General, I will support it for it to be effective in the objectives that we are set for ourselves.
María Espinosa, human rights.
Well, it's very easy to say, oh yes, I will be a champion on human rights. Very easy to say, difficult to do when you look at the UN. When I serve here as ambassador, I serve at the Human Rights Council. I saw the potential that the human rights architecture has because we have created it, collectively. I saw the potential to ensure that human rights were used for prevention, for peace, for development. I understood that universality, non-politicization, the indivisible nature of human rights were extremely important. But I also saw what were the tensions among member states, duplication with the work of human rights in New York, the lack of coherence of the work, mandates, multiplying, and we know that is the pillar that is chronically underfunded in the system. So what to do? That's the question. I would say that 20 years of the Human Rights Council, this very year, perhaps it is time that we rethink how is that we have built this very complex human rights architecture, because everything the UN does needs to have human dignity at the center.
And this issue of sexual reproductive health rights.
Well, and of course, absolutely. I also looked at the UN 80 process and the proposal for a human rights group. I think it's a good initiative, only if it's fully deployed to ensure that the UN delivers on human rights as one. There is no competition, there is no duplication, there is a system working together to ensure, and I say again, that the human dignity is at the center of
and the
everything
sexual reproductive health rights, the other two answered that, how would you answer it?
Well, this is part of the package,
Okay.
I agree. Is not, human rights are indivisible, economic and social rights, political, political and civil rights, they all come together. It is a complex package, but we need to do something about it to ensure that the system we have created is well-funded, operates well, and serves humanity.
Thank you to all our questions. And now going to up the tempo because we have our closing statements. And in the interest of transparency, to determine the order, I've got this little bag here, and I'm going to be pulling up. We did that also at the beginning, where people would be seated, who would go first, and so on. So the first 90 seconds, max 2 minutes, I shall be the time police. First to go to the stage is María Fernanda Espinosa. So your time will start when you get to the stage. Better hurry. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it speaks volume to see this room absolutely packed. The interest of the UN remains there. Excellencies, colleagues and friends, there is no doubt that we live in a world in fire. Wars multiplying, climate shocks accelerating, human rights are under strain, and most of all, trust in our institutions is fading. There are vast problems, but I think we all know that the answer cannot be a collection of band-aids. It cannot be just another report or another committee or another slogan. The crisis that the UN faces today requires something bolder than a chief administrator. It needs a peacemaker, a top manager, a strong advocate for international law and the UN Charter. I think this moment calls for a Renaissance Secretary General, a Secretary General capable of restoring the UN's moral authority, a Secretary General capable of giving the world hope that a better and more peaceful world can be built if we act together. A vision where the UN acts before crises explode through an effective early action hub. A vision where development is not measured by speeches or slogans, but by whether people have jobs, food, education, dignity. A vision where technology is shaped by and for humanity, not only by power or profit. I think at this moment we cannot afford a Secretary General who simply manages the decline, but is brave enough and equipped enough to make the transformations the organization needs. We need a Secretary General that can speak with courage, listen with humility, and bring countries back to a shared sense of purpose. That is the leadership I believe this moment requires. That is a leadership I will bring to the UN. I thank you.
So, and the next panelist to go up, Michelle Bachelet.
Well, the United Nations is not a perfect institution, and we know it very well, for the ones who have worked there. But even imperfect institutions, they can protect people. And when they fail, people pay the price. I'm not running for Secretary General to administer the present. I'm running to help build the United Nations that the next 80 years demand. And here's my commitment to you. I will defend multilateralism, not any multilateralism, but one firmly anchored in the principles and values of the UN Charter. I will be an independent Secretary General, always on the ground. When conflicts arise, I will be there, offering mediation, insisting on respect for international law. I will reform this organization to make it more agile, more efficient, more accountable, and I will do so through dialogue and building consensus. But let me be clear, no reform can come at the expense of the principles that define the institution. The pillars of peace and security, sustainable development and human rights are not adjustable, are not negotiable. Leadership means achieving difficult objectives while keeping them intact. My message, of course, is all for people throughout the world, to boys and especially girls. It is possible. With courage, with creativity, I place my experience and my commitment to principles at the service of the great task of becoming also the first woman ever to be Secretary General of the United Nations. And I will be honored, deeply honored by your trust. But let me say, I think to be a first Secretary General, it will be worthy if one can bring to the table all countries, all in how we organize the Secretariat and the architecture, everyone that feels, because the 193 member states needs to feel that the United Nations is theirs.
Thank you. Rebecca Grynspan, very quickly. Sorry.
Well, hello, Geneva. We didn't say that before. So let me start. My parents were refugees of the Second World War. A small country with no army took them in and treated them with respect and dignity. I am the daughter of peace. I know what wars takes away and what peace makes possible. I am running because peace is in peril and trust in the UN and in international organizations is eroding. We live in a very complex, multipolar world with more conflicts today than in 1945. We need a Secretary General that can build bridges, talk to all, negotiate with all, regardless. But we also know that in this multipolar multipolarity, we need to choose. Multipolarity is not a choice, it's a fact. What is a choice is multilateralism. A world that is multipolar without multilateralism will drive us to fragmentation. A world of multipolarity with multilateralism will allow us, holds the promise of decentralization and a better world. And this is true not only for the small and medium-sized countries, where our resilience comes from our interdependence. It's also true for the big powers, because they were the ones that lost the most, fought the most, and died the most in the wars of the 20th century. As I said earlier in this panel, we live in a skeptical age. That skepticism is real. I have heard it through the campaign trail, and we must listen. So, if I can ask one thing from you, it is not to give away your agency. This moment in history, this race, is a choice, a real choice. So yes, be critical, but choose.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. So that's it from this UN Secretary-General debate from the Maison de la Paix. Will the next Secretary-General be one of these three candidates, or Rafael Grossi, or Macky Sall, or indeed, actually, it's entirely possible that some new names may emerge. The General Assembly vote on the recommendation of the Security Council, we should know by the end of the year, is going to be a long summer, candidates. From me, Zain Abadawi, and everybody else on the team here from Geneva, goodbye. Yeah.